You might recall this giant-sized comic book from my earlier video about Walt Disney's Babes in Toyland, and it was also seen in my first trailer. That's right, now there's two trailers. I just introduced a new trailer for Tullywood TV last week, so if you haven't seen it, check it out, and please share it with anyone you think might be interested in the videos that are presented here. But today we are going to talk about comic books, Disney comic books, and specifically Disney comic books that are based on one of the Disney live-action films. As most of you know, Walt Disney released his first all-live-action film, Treasure Island, in 1950. And from that point on, all Disney live-action films, well, certainly most of them, were adapted into comic book form. The Treasure Island comic book actually came out a little bit later in 1955, apparently to coincide with its being showcased on the Disneyland TV show, but for the most part, all Disney live-action films were printed as comic books at the same time they were in the theaters. Most Disney live-action films, you're asking? Yes. Westward Ho! The Wagons? Yup. Moon Pilot? Of course. Babes in Toyland? Duh. The Love Bug? Sure. Swiss Family Robinson? Absolutely. I'm sure you're thinking, what about the Boatniks? Oh, don't be ridiculous. Of course the Boatniks was not adapted into it. I'm kidding. Of course it was. So you can see that most Disney live-action films were adapted into comic book form, and perhaps even more remarkable, most of them were drawn by one artist, Dan Spiegle, acclaimed as a master illustrator of the comic book form. One of his first great achievements was the Hopalong Cassidy comic strip, which he drew from 1950 through 1955. That comic strip was immensely popular. And in 1955, he started with Western Publishing, creators of the Disney comic books, and from that point on drew, again, most of the Disney live-action adaptations. So we're going to see some of those today. Now let's start with the Shaggy Dog, which, interestingly enough, I have here as a reprint. For some reason, it's paired with The Cat from Outer Space. I'm not sure why this was a double issue, but it was. This was from 1978 and was the adaptation of The Cat from Outer Space, drawn by Dan Spiegle. Well, yes, of course it was, and beautifully done. Of course, it helps when the film itself is good, and this was one of the best Disney films from the 1970s. And then, of course, as mentioned, we have the Shaggy Dog, drawn by Dan Spiegle, and beautifully done. Captures the comedy and the action and the special effects and all that makes that movie great, and all in color, unlike the movie itself. Now, one thing I've noticed is that comic book readers of today will sometimes look at something like this and say, oh, that doesn't look anything like Fred MacMurray, who of course was the star of the Shaggy Dog. Couldn't they find an artist who knew how to draw him? Well, Dan Spiegle certainly could draw Fred MacMurray, but there was an issue with rights and permissions. So if a deal could be made with a movie actor, great. His likeness was used in the comic book. If no such deal could be made for whatever reason, because there were legalities, residuals, and royalties sometimes, then the character was drawn in a different way. So here we have on the very first page Mr. Daniels, and his face is thinner, I would say, than Fred MacMurray's, longer, and also has a mustache. They were going to great pains to make him look different from Fred MacMurray so that Fred MacMurray or his lawyers wouldn't say, hey, you didn't get permission. Remember that the next time you see one of these comic books, it's not a matter of the artist not being able to draw them. It was done on purpose, usually. 1957 brought Old Yeller. I have a reprint of that comic book when it was reissued to theaters, but it is, of course, the same, has the great art by Dan Spiegle, beautiful adaptation of all the action and heartwarming drama and comedy, even, of the film, one of Walt Disney's best loved. Now, if this inspires you to see Old Yeller on Disney Plus or home video, great, for it's truly one of Walt Disney's best. But if you're a dog lover, spoiler alert, well, just brace yourself for the climax. As I mentioned in my video about Little Golden Books, based on Disney live-action films. One thing that's so interesting about Dan Spiegle's Disney career is that to draw these live-action adaptations, he often was invited to the Disney studio, sometimes to visit the set, other times to see a rough version or a rough cut of the film, so that he could all the more accurately and with artistry and authenticity draw these comic books. In the case of Old Yeller, he even went on location to draw the stars and the settings. Now, you heard me say that every Disney live-action film, almost, was adapted into comic book form, and sure enough, here is Herbie Rides Again. And I just love that psychedelic cover. Fun art. Capturing the comedy and all the action. Really great. And I'm sure you noticed by now this title, Walt Disney Showcase. Well, in 1970, Western Publishing, either under the Gold Key imprint or Whitman, as it says here, started publishing this title as an anthology. So sometimes Walt Disney Showcase featured one of the Disney characters, such as Pluto, Moby Duck, Will Bad Wolf, so on. But whenever there was a movie adaptation, whether it be a brand new movie or a re-release, it was published under this single title, Walt Disney Showcase. But prior to that, these were one-offs, such as one of the best, In Search of the Castaways, from 1962. So we have these great photos on the cover. Usually the movie adaptations were photos, publicity stills used to promote the movie, so what would be better for a live-action movie than that? Of course, In Search of the Castaways starred Hayley Mills. It's a great portrait here. And this really fun and exciting adventure, action, kind of science fiction fantasy. It's based on a Jules Verne book, after all. It's really captured beautifully by Dan Spiegel's art. Sometimes if there were no ads, there were stills from the film to kind of tell the story and set things up. And in the back, an educational feature about the Andes, because much of the movie takes place in that mountain region. This is a beautifully done comic book. Now here, to show the variety of Walt Disney's live-action films and their comic book adaptations, we have The Happiest Millionaire. There he is right there, Fred MacMurray. And it looks like he was lucky to make it onto the cover of his own comic book, because here we have John Davidson, Leslie Ann Warren, Tommy Steele, and George the Alligator showcased here. From 1967, as mentioned, these comic books were published to help promote the movie while it was being screened in theaters. So it was publicity for the movie, but also kind of a fun way for audiences to relive the film after they saw it. In those days before home video or streaming, or even these films being shown on TV much. And the press books usually encouraged the movie theater owners to use the comic books as perhaps giveaways to tie in with variety stores, nearby drugstores, or what have you that might have the comic book as an additional way to promote. And for anyone who's interested, I've written an article about In Search of the Castaways for D23.com. So you can find that article there. I'll put a link in the show notes. And we're going to end with what is regarded usually as Walt Disney's greatest live-action film, Mary Poppins. You'll recognize this Comics Digest from my video about Disney's 50 Happy Years celebration, and you can see the logo right here. And as part of that celebration in 1973, that 1964 film was re-released to theaters. Comic books were again part of the push, and the deluxe giant comic book was published in, ironically, this smaller form. But we also had that very same year, again, an issue of Walt Disney Showcase. This published the standard size comic book adaptation of Mary Poppins, because Mary Poppins was such a big deal that there were two different comic books, standard size and a giant comic book version. And for anyone who would like to see the giant comic book version, well, here it is right here. The standard size comic book was 32 pages at 12 cents. while the deluxe version was 64 pages at 25 cents. And to make it a little more deluxe, it has this cardboard cover, making it a little sturdier and a little more special. Great portrait here, partially seen in color here. And then again, stills from the film to kind of tell the story a little bit, setting it all up. That's marvelous. Now, Dan Spiegle drew this deluxe version, and from what I can gather, Mike Ahrens then based his art for the standard size comic on this longer version, because in the 32-page adaptation, many of the panels and drawings are very similar, just drawn by a different artist. Of course, there's many more pages in this that are not in the standard size. So it really looks like Mike Ahrens based his art on the existing Dan Spiegle sort of as its model. And there's other differences too, but basically speaking, so that's kind of interesting. But anyhow, this is a beauty, and I feel very lucky to have such a well-preserved copy of this comic book. Whoever was the original owner did a wonderful job of preserving this, and I'm very grateful for that. Now, what's so interesting, as you would know if you saw my video about Mary Poppins, and if you haven't, please take a look. The songs are by Richard and Robert Sherman, and the comic book makes an effort to incorporate lyrics of the songs. We have certainly some of the songs included, or quoted at least. A Spoonful of Sugar, Jolly Holiday. We couldn't leave out Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, and so forth. Interestingly, down here with all the copyright notices, we do have the songs credited and with their own separate copyright to Richard and Robert Sherman, the Sherman Brothers. The comic book publisher took great pains to include the songs. That was not done with the Happiest Millionaire, for example, because, of course, the songs were so important and were recognized by Disney even before release as being something quite extraordinary. So it's really wonderful to have that official adaptation, including some of the songs, in comic book form. So I hope you've enjoyed this brief look at a few Disney comics. We're certainly going to revisit that subject in a future video. But in the meantime, please be with us next time when we will have Kenny the Gardener, The Guy Under the Stairs, and of course Larry Bud Melman, who will be here to debate the topic, Resolved. They pelted us with rocks and garbage.